Let's continue in Barahin, the depository of basic arguments for the creed. And so, the author, may Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala have mercy upon him, said, وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ وُجُوبِ الْقِدَمِ لَهُ تَعَالَى. And concerning the arguments for the necessity of eternality for him, exalted is he. فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ لَمْ يَكُنْ قَدِيمًا. It is that, had he not been eternal, that means beginningless, لَكَانَ حَادِثًا, then he would have been eventual, that means having a beginning. He would have had a start. He would have been created. He would have been an occurrence. فَيَفْتَقِرُ إِلَى مُحْدِث, and then he would require someone to make him occur. فَيَلْزَمُ الدَّوْرُ أَوِ التَّسَلْسُلُ, and then that would lead to a beginningless circle or a beginningless chain. Because this one that made him occur, is he eternal or he has a beginning? So if he's eternal, that means there's one eternal creator. And if he has a beginning, then who gave him beginning? Someone else other than the one he created? Or the one he created gave him a beginning? So if the one who he created gave him a beginning, then that leads to a beginningless circle, because that would mean he gave being to what gave being to him. So that's a beginningless circle, and that's impossible. And if whoever gave him being was also created by someone else, then that one, did someone create him? If so, then that one, did someone create him? If so, then that one, did someone create him? If so, then this leads to a beginningless chain. Both of those are impossible, a beginningless circle and a beginningless chain. Let me know if that's not clear for you, please. وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ وُجُوبِ الْبَقَاءِ لَهُ تَعَالَى. And concerning the argument for the necessity of everlastingness for him, exalted is he. فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ أَمْكَنَ أَنْ يَلْحَقَهُ الْعَدَمُ. It is that, had it been possible for non-existence to catch him or follow him, to come after him, for his existence to vanish and then be followed by nothingness, لَانْتَفَى عَنْهُ الْقِدَمُ, then eternality would have been impossible for him. Because they say, the scholars that is, مَا ثَبَتَ قِدَمُهُ إِسْتَحَالَ عَدَمُهُ. Anything that is confirmed to be beginningless is then impossible to be non-existent. Anything confirmed to be beginningless is then impossible to be non-existent. So, had it been possible that non-existence would catch him, that means come after him, then eternality would be altogether invalid for him. لِكَوْنِ وُجُودِهِ حِينَئِذٍ جَائِزًا لَا وَاجِبًا. Because his existence then, had it been possible for non-existence to come after him, then his existence would be merely possible, not necessary. وَالْجَائِزُ لَا يَكُونُ وُجُودُهُ إِلَّا حَادِثًا. And anything possible, its existence would not be but created. Its existence would not be but eventual. Anything possible, its existence would not be but possible, eventual, created. كيف وقد سبق قريبا وجوب قدمه تعالى وبقائه. How would that be? How would it be that his existence is possible and created when it has just passed that it's necessary, that it just passed, Yani, how would that be when the necessity of his eternality, exalted is he, and his everlastingness just passed? We just mentioned it. So his existence is then not merely possible, and his existence is not created. وأما برهان وجوب مخالفته تعالى للحوادث. And as for the argument for the necessity of his being different from the creations, exalted is he. فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ مَاثَلَ شَيْئًا مِنْهَا. That's because had he been comparable to any of them, لَكَانَ حَادِثًا مِثْلَهَا, then he would be created like they are. Why? For a very simple rule. Whenever something resembles something else in any way, then it could resemble it in every way. Whenever something is comparable to something else in some way, then it could be comparable to it in every way. Or we could say this in another way. Whenever two things are similar, then whatever is applicable to one is applicable to the other. Whenever two things are similar, then whatever is applicable to one is applicable to the other. So, for example, Yani, we gave this example before. Your phone. Your phone that you have, if you have one, did you ever seen it thrown in the toilet and then stop working? You never saw that, I'm assuming. I'm assuming you never saw your own phone, the one that you carry every time, thrown into the toilet and then stop working. You never saw that. So since you never saw that and you never experienced that, would you think that that wouldn't happen to your phone? And therefore you would try and throw it into the toilet and see if it'll stop working? You're not going to do that probably, because you know that phones, when they get thrown into the toilet, they stop working unless they're waterproof. Because why? Yani, based on a simple rule that is embedded in all of us, even if you didn't think about it much before. Whenever two things are similar, then whatever could happen to one could happen to the other. So that's why do you turn your stove off in the house? So that your house doesn't burn down, for example. Even if you never saw your house burn down, you know your house could burn down because houses burn down. And like that, why do you stop at the red light when there's a lot of traffic? Even if you never got hit by a car, because people get hit by cars. So you're not going to say, I never got hit by a car before. Let me mess around and find out. You're not going to do that based on that same principle. Whenever two things are similar, then whatever could happen to one could happen to the other. So that's what he says here. He says, فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ مَاثَلَ شَيْئًا مِنْهَا. This is because had Allah been comparable to anything, to any of them, to any of the created things, لَكَانَ حَادِثًا مِثْلَهَا, then he would have been created like them. That's what the Wahhabis don't understand. Because Wahhabis believe that Allah is not absolutely different from the creation. He's relatively different. The Wahhabis believe, and some of them have documented, like Ibn Uthaymeen, that there must be some degree of comparability just for the sake of our comprehension. And had he been absolutely different with no similarity in any way whatsoever, then we wouldn't have even been able to comprehend anything about him. That's what they say. That's blasphemy. وَذَلِكَ مُحَالٌ. That's impossible. لِمَا عَرَفْتَ قَبْلُ مِنْ وُجُوبِ قِدَمِهِ تَعَالَى وَبَقَائِهِ. Because of what you have come to know of the necessity of his eternality, exalted is he, and his everlastingness. Yes, because the eternality of God and his dissimilarity to the creations, the eternality of God and his dissimilarity to the creations are synonymous. Just like the dissimilarity of God and his oneness, they are synonymous. Just like the oneness of God and his eternality, they are synonymous. Just like the eternality of God and his absolute independence, they are synonymous. وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ وُجُوبِ قِيَامِهِ تَعَالَى بِنَفْسِهِ. And as for the argument for the necessity of his independence, exalted is he, فَلِأَنَّهُ تَعَالَى لَوْ احْتَاجَ إِلَى مَحَلٍ لَكَانَ الصِّفَةِ. It is that he, the exalted, had he needed something, some space, had he needed a vessel, had he needed to be the extension of something else, or had he needed to exist by extension of something else, then he would have been an attribute. وَالصِّفَةُ لَا تَتَّصِفُ بِصِفَاتِ الْمَعَانِي. And an attribute, it doesn't have attributes, because for an attribute to have attributes leads to a beginningless chain. Because if you say this attribute has an attribute, then it would be valid to say, and that attribute has an attribute. And then it would be valid to keep going forever. لا تتصف بصفات المعاني ولا المعنوية. An attribute, it wouldn't have attributes that have an extra meaning, nor would it have derivative adjectives from those attributes that have an extra meaning. Now that part there, I'm not going to try to explain it. If it's clear for you, then that's great. If it's not clear for you, then another time. Well, we did explain what it means to be sifat ma'na and what it means to be ma'nawi. So you have to review your notes there. But the simple meaning of what he's saying here is that what I just said to you, an attribute wouldn't have an attribute, but God has attributes. So it's not valid that God would be an attribute, because if he were an attribute, he wouldn't have any attributes, because an attribute wouldn't have an attribute. And if he's not an attribute, then that means he doesn't exist through something else. He doesn't have a vessel through which he exists. His existence is not by extension of something else's existence. وَمَوْلَانَا جَلَّ وَعَزَّ يَجِبُ اتصافه بِهِمَا. And our Lord, great and invincible, it is necessary that he be attributed with attributes that have a connotation like life, knowledge, power, will, sight, hearing, speech. It's necessary that he be attributed with such attributes. And it's necessary that he would have the adjectives that come from having such attributes, like being knowledgeable, being powerful, being a willer, being a hearer, being a seer, being alive, being a speaker. فَلَيْسَ بِصِفَةٍ. Therefore, God is not an attribute. Yani, why are we talking about that? Because we're arguing here that he doesn't need anything. So if he doesn't need anything, if he's absolutely independent, then it means he's not an attribute, because attributes are dependent. Attributes exist through a vessel. Yani, if it's a created attribute. But attributes don't have attributes. Put it this way. Let me say it this way. At this spot here. Attributes don't have attributes, like we already argued, because that leads to a beginningless chain. وَلَوْ احْتَاجَ إِلَى مُخَصِّصٍ. And if he were in need of a specifier, That means a particularizer, someone who makes him one way or another way. لَكَانَ حَادِثًا, then he would have been eventual. He would have been created. He would have been an event or an occurrence. كيف وقد قام البرهان على وجوب قدمه تعالى وبقائه. And how would that be when the evidence has already been established for the necessity of his eternality? Exalted is he and his everlastingness. وأما برهان وجوب الوحدانية له تعالى. And concerning the argument for the necessity of his oneness, exalted is he. فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ لَمْ يَكُنْ وَاحِدًا. It is that, had he not been one, لَزِمَ أَلَّا يُوجَدَ شَيْءٌ مِّنَ الْعَالَمِ. This would dictate that nothing of the world would even exist. لِلُزُومِ عَجْزِهِ حِينَئِذ. Because by not being one, he would necessarily be weak. Why? Because he would have a counterpart. If he has a counterpart, then he is weak. I'm trying to think, what were we reading recently? The tafsir of An-Nasafi, Surah Al-Ikhlas. He gave an argument. He said, I'm paraphrasing, if there were two creators and one of them created something, just by that it would mean that the other one is weak. Why? Because the other one wouldn't be able to create what the first one created. Why? Because it's already created. It exists now already. We're not talking about creating something like it. We're talking about creating the very one. So if there were two creators and one of them created something, he would just by that render the other one weak, because the other one now can't create that one since it's already created. And then, to remind you, Imam An-Nasafi went a step further. He said, and if you were to say, but wait a minute, by that argument, you're saying that the first one rendered himself weak too, because he just created something. So now it's created. So how could he create it and he just created it the first time? He said the answer is he created it. So the fact that he created it means that he had the power. So he's not weak by creating it. He didn't weaken himself by creating it, because by creating it, he actually fulfilled his will. So it's the other one that would be weak. So here, that's what As-Sanusiyyah is saying here. Had he not been one, this would dictate that nothing of the world would even exist, because this would necessarily mean that he's weak. And look, all the people who believe in polytheism, they confirm weakness for what they worship. Look at the Christians. Didn't they say, although they worshipped Jesus, didn't they say he was born? And didn't they say he died? They even said he died. That's crazy. And the Greeks, didn't they say that those gods were fighting and defeating each other and punishing each other, overcoming each other, and like that? And the Hindus, they say like that. A Hindu will even say to you, why do you think God can't be weak? This statement of Imam An-Nasafi, of Imam As-Sanusiyyah here, it coincides with the proof in the book of Allah when Allah Ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ. There was never a God with him. إِذَا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. Had there been, then every God would have taken what it created, and then some of them would have overcame others, dominated others. وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ وُجُوبِ اتصافه تعالى بالقدرة والإرادة والعلم والحياة. And as for the argument for the necessity of his being attributed with power, will, knowledge, and life, exalted is he. فلأنه لو انتفى شيء منها لما وجد شيء من الحوادث. It is because had any one of those been negated, then nothing of created things would have existed. Yani, because what? Amongst the attributes of Allah are those that are proven by the existence of creations: power, will, knowledge, and life. Or, like some scholars said, those that are proven by his doings. And other attributes of his are proven by the necessity of his being perfect. Other attributes of his are proven by the necessity of his being perfect, which are these that he's going to mention now. Let's see how his argument goes, though. So he says, وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ وُجُوبِ السَّمْعِ لَهُ تَعَالَى وَالْبَصَرِ وَالْكَلَامِ. And as for the necessity of, and as for the argument for the necessity of hearing for him, exalted is he, and sight and speech. So what I just told you is, it is the necessity of his being attributed with perfection, because he's alive. So if he's alive, then either he sees or he's blind, or and either he hears or he's deaf, or and he speaks or he's dumb, meaning mute. Because once you confirm life, then there are other meanings that come along with that. If you're talking about something that's not alive, then you're not going to say knowledgeable or ignorant. You're not going to say hearing or deaf, neither one. So here, my pen, we're not going to say this pen is deaf because it can't hear. No. We're going to say this pen is neither hearing nor deaf because it's not alive. If someone's alive, then there are other meanings that come along with that. Yani means you need to understand what being alive means. What does life even mean? So once we confirm life, then there are other meanings that we need to investigate. Hearing or deaf, seeing or blind, speaking or mute or dumb. Out of these, some of them are imperfections. Blindness, deafness, muteness, these are imperfections. So some of the attributes of Allah, the argument for their necessity is the necessity of his being perfect. And some of his attributes, the argument for their necessity is the confirmation of his doings, yani the creations. What did As-Sanusiyyah say though? He said, وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ وُجُوبِ السَّمْعِ لَهُ تَعَالَى. And as for the argument for the necessity of hearing for him, exalted is he. وَالْبَصَرِ وَالْكَلَامِ. And sight and speech. فَالْكِتَابُ وَالسُّنَّةُ وَالْإِجْمَاعِ. It's the book and the sunnah and the consensus. So that's what he said. But that's true for all the attributes. That's not particular to these. He says, وَأَيْضًا لَوْ لَمْ يَتَّصِفْ بِهَا لَزِمَ أَنْ يَتَّصِفَ بِأَوْدَادِهَا. He says, and also, had he not been attributed with them, then it's necessary that he would be attributed with their opposites. But that's true for the others too. وَهِيَ نَقَائِص. And those opposites are imperfections. وَالنَّقْصُ عَلَيْهِ تَعَالَى مُحَالٌ. And imperfection for him, exalted is he, is impossible. Now he got closer to the argument that I gave you initially, which is what our Shaykh taught us. Rahimahullahu ta'ala. وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ كَوْنِ فِعْلِ الْمُمْكِنَاتِ. أو تركها جائزا في حقه تعالى. And as for the argument that doing anything possible or not doing it is valid concerning him, exalted is he, yani creating whatever he wills or not creating it. فلأنه لو وجب عليه تعالى شيء منها عقلا, it is that had doing any of that been necessary for him intellectually, meaning he must do something, أو استحال عقلا, or had any of that been impossible intellectually, meaning he can't do it, لانقلب الممكن واجبا أو مستحيلا, then the possibility would have turned into a necessity or an impossibility. Yani, then reality would be topsy-turvy. You said, what if someone says that just because one doesn't have certain attribute doesn't mean he has its opposite attribute, like how you don't say about an inanimate object is alive or dead? Let me put it to you this way. There's a rule. When is it that negating an attribute would confirm its opposite? There's a rule. When those attributes alternate, then it would necessitate that, then denying one of them would necessitate confirming the other. When there are attributes that alternate on this, that alternate, then denying one is confirming the other. So, for example, here's my pen again. So it's moving now. I'm turning it in my fingers. So moving means now it's not still. If I make it still, that means now it's not moving, because moving and stillness alternate. So it can't escape one of those. Now, so your question means, what if someone says, well, just because it's moving doesn't mean it's not still? The answer is, yeah, it does mean it's not still, because why? Because it's a body. So being a body, by being a body, makes it have to be one of those two. Once it is confirmed to be a body, which it is, then it must have one of these two alternative or alternating attributes. If one is negated, the other is confirmed. So why, if he is not attributed with sight or hearing or speech, he would be blind or deaf or mute? I already said the answer. Who can tell me? Why, if he's not attributed with sight, hearing, or speech, it necessarily means that he would be deaf, blind, and dumb? What's the answer to that? Which I just told you a few minutes ago. Anyone? 5, 4. Because he's alive. Correct. Because he's alive. So once we confirm the attribute of life, then it means he has to be seeing or blind, because those alternate now. Just like we said, if something's a body, it has to be moving or still. Also, if something exists, then it can't be non-existent. If something doesn't exist, then it can't be existent. If something has a beginning, then it can't be eternal. And if something is eternal, then it can't have a beginning. So this is what I'm saying, clarifying the answer for you. But you can follow up if you want to. Feel free. It's a good question. Because you could follow up. I already know which way you could go, but I'm not going to tell you. So if you want to follow up, go ahead. If you don't have anything in mind, don't try to conjure it up, though. That's not good. Like right now, I'm saying to you, I know which way you could go, and I'm not going to tell you. But don't sit there and try to think about it if it's not coming to you. That's not good, because then you're going to develop a habit. One would develop a habit of trying to conjure up questions when he doesn't have one. That's not good. I'm going to continue now. Wow, this Sanusi's nice, huh? He's on some scientific stuff here. MashaAllah. So let me back up here. He says, وَأَمَّا بُرْهَانُ كَوْنِ فِعْلِ الْمُمْكِنَاتِ أَوْ تَرْكِهَا جَائِزًا فِي حَقِّهِ تَعَالَى. And as for the necessity of doing something possible, anything possible, or not doing it, as for that being valid concerning God, exalted is He, yani not necessary and not impossible. فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ وَجَبَ, had it been necessary, alayhi ta'ala, for him to do something, aqlan, intellectually, which that's a philosophical belief. When someone believes that creating is necessary for God, then that means he's going to deny that God has a will. And that means he's going to confirm that creations are eternal. He's going to say it is created and it's eternal at the same time. فَلِأَنَّهُ لَوْ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهِ تَعَالَى شَيْءٌ مِنْهَا عَقْلًا. It is because had doing anything been necessary for him, exalted is he intellectually, had that been intellectually necessary. أَوْ اسْتَحَالَ عَقْلًا, or had it been impossible intellectually for him to do anything, which means create something. لَانْقَلَبَ الْمُمْكِنُ وَاجِبًا أَوْ مُسْتَحِيلًا. Then the possibility would have turned into a necessity or an impossibility. وَذَلِكَ لَا يُعْقَلْ, and that is inconceivable. Yani, that is overturning reality. That makes reality topsy-turvy. That means we live in crazy world. وَأَمَّا الرُّسُلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ. طيب. So we just said a lot of deep stuff, deep information. Now he finished talking about the attributes of God. He wants to start talking about the messengers. And we have about 10 or 12 minutes left. But you tell me, should we stop here and give your brains a chance to cool down and digest? And then we can start from the top talking about the messengers next time? So we'll stop here then.